Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really taking a plunge into a film that, well, it really changed things for Brazilian cinema on a global scale.
Mm.
City of God, Fernando Meirelles and Cadillanc's film from 2002.
Absolutely. And the stuff we're digging into today, it's all been put together specifically for you, thinking about what a film studies student needs. A whole collection of notes, research, bits and pieces to really help you get into the weeds of this really complex and um, incredibly influential movie.
Exactly. So think of today's mission as like uh, building an understanding of City of God from the ground up.
Mm.
We're going to dissect its key formal elements, how it's shot, how it's cut, the whole look and sound of it.
Right.
Then we'll dig into the meaning it creates, how it portrays characters, themes, and crucially, how it makes you, the viewer, respond.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we just have to talk about the context, the historical stuff, social, institutional. It's all vital for understanding this film.
Yeah, it really is. It's one of those rare films, isn't it? A national cinema piece that just exploded internationally, known for that really unflinching, energetic portrayal of the Rio favelas.
Seen mostly through the eyes, well, literally, the lens of Rocket, our narrator, the aspiring photographer.
Precisely.
So let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into those core building blocks, the key elements of its form. And you can't really even start talking about the look of City of God without talking about the cinematography, Cesar Charlon's work.
Oh, definitely. Charlene's camera.
Yeah.
It's more than just showing the favela, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources point out how the favela itself feels like a character and one that changes.
How so?
Well, it starts off feeling kind of open,
Hmm.
almost sprawling, but then visually it transforms into this much more cramped, walled-in maze. These narrow streets, you actually feel the space closing in around the characters as the film goes on.
And the sources mentioned something about that feeling of confinement, the use of overhead shots. What did you think about how that works visually?
Yeah, that's a key point. It really, really highlights how trapped they are. Looking down on them like that, it just visually hammers home the idea that they're hemmed in, by the buildings, the social structures. Very little room to maneuver, literally and figuratively.
A visual metaphor for their lack of options, basically.
Exactly. And think about how killings are often sped up, that technique. It adds to this sense of like a chaotic, unstoppable cycle of violence, time just rushing forward almost frantically.
Okay, so let's zoom in on a specific sequence the sources highlighted as really interesting cinematically. The story of the apartment. This is where the film kind of breaks its own rules, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, for a film that's known for this incredibly fluid, dynamic camera movement, this sequence is the total opposite. The camera is just locked down, fixed.
Like watching a play.
Exactly like watching a play. You're positioned outside it, looking at the space, not really immersed in it like you are elsewhere in the film.
And visually, within that fixed frame, there's a lot going on. The wide angle lens, the deep focus, it makes things look really distorted, right? Things close up look huge, the background tiny.
Yeah, that exaggerated perspective. And the story unfolds, dissolves, doesn't it?
Yeah.
People appear, disappear, the room changes, even the wall color shifts. It creates this tableau effect, like watching these living pictures unfold.
Mm.
It's such a stark contrast to the usual kinetic style.
Now, compare that stillness with, say, the disco scene where Benet gets killed.
Right. Big contrast.
You're right in the middle of the energy, aren't you? Shots from the dancer's eye level, you feel the music, the movement. But then it cuts to those high-angle shots from Rocket's viewpoint, up in the DJ booth.
Yes. And that's such a perfect example of cinematography reinforcing character,
Yeah.
Those high angles. They visually emphasize where Rocket is. He's there physically, but he's mainly an observer.
Watching, documenting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's watching from a slight remove, not really caught up in the main drama unfolding below him.
Okay, so moving on from the camera work, let's talk mise en scène. Everything in the frame, how it's arranged to tell the story. The sources had some really good insights here, starting with the story of the Tender Trio.
What was interesting there was how it initially looks visually.
Mm.
It's got this warmth, almost a romantic feel to it. The sources connected it back to older Brazilian outlaw films, the Cangaceiros.
Gives it this kind of nostalgic, slightly mythic vibe at first.
And this is where the film's really smart Rocket's voiceover just constantly cuts through that romantic image. You're seeing this almost heroic picture, but he's telling you the gritty, often quite banal reality.
Right, that disconnect.
Yeah, that gap between the visual poetry and the narrative truth, that's a huge part of the film's style. And remember that sepia photo of Benet and Dice?
Ah, yeah. That keeps popping up later like a memory fragment. It acts as this visual reminder of a supposed better time, a time of friendship,
Yeah.
that maybe never really was or was very short-lived.
Mm-hmm. A symbol of what's lost, what gets corrupted, absolutely. Then think about Zay's transformation. From the kid, Dice, to the man, Zay Pequeno. Visually, how is that shown?
Through that montage, right, 6 images leading up to that really striking voodoo ceremony. Candlelit,
Yeah.
intense.
Yeah, it feels like this dark rebirth. Making a pact. Rocket's narration links it to him getting power through Exu, the Orisha, framing it like God has abandoned him.
And visually, suddenly he's got all the gangster stuff, the gold chains, the cars, the girls. But it's all happening in the favela. It's this jarring mix of global gangster movie visuals with the specific local reality.
Right. They're not just local thugs anymore. They're adopting the look, the visual language of international crime. It signals their rise in that violent world.
Yeah.
I'll contrast that with Rocket's mise-en-scène.
Yeah, he's consistently shown in places linked to, well, normality, freedom almost, the newspaper office, or remember him in the delivery van.
With the view of the mountain in the distance.
Exactly. That mountain view feels really important. It's a visual link to the world outside the favela, the world Rocket wants to join, where he eventually finds his way out. It's a symbol of possibility, unlike the favela itself, which just feels more and more closed in.
Good point. Okay, so from mise-en-scène, let's shift to the engine room, the editing. Daniel Rezunde's work.
The sources really emphasized his approach, using effect, using them to enhance the feeling, the emotion.
And you see it constantly. Tense moments get sped up, makes them feel even more chaotic. They'll freeze a frame on someone's face, like burning it into your memory.
Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting was the note about the third act of the film, how they deliberately used cuts that might even seem badly made.
To make you uncomfortable.
Exactly, to ramp up that feeling of unease.
An intentional roughness, it's part of the strategy, isn't it? To create this visceral, sometimes jarring experience. And that restless style is there right from the opening scene. No slow establishing shot, just flashes, close-ups.
The knife, the hand, the sharpening stone,
Right.
punctuated by cuts to black. Then boom, a photographic flash hits Rocket.
And that very first shot of Rocket behind bars, the sources revealed that's actually a flash forward.
Yeah.
We see him there, we know he's important, but the film holds back the other side of that shot, the reverse shot showing Zeb bribing the cops until way later. It introduces Rocket as just a piece of the puzzle first.
It's clever structuring. And the editing also uses those amazing sweeping circling shots. They often act as bridges, don't they? Connecting time, characters, moving from fast cuts to these fluid shots that show Rocket growing up or the favela changing over time.
It visually links the evolution of the place and the people.
Definitely. And the opening sequence, the flying chicken sequence, it's a masterclass in editing for suspense and meaning. All those tight close-ups at the start, bits of food prep, it's confusing, builds tension.
Then the first clear mid-shot, a live chicken, tied up, immediately gives you that sense of constraint.
And the sources mentioned that Brazilian saying flying chicken, something that looks free but is doomed. The sequence just perfectly visualizes that. The chicken makes a run for it, jumps down, and then you get that low-angle shot from its perspective, seeing the plate of blood on the ground.
Oof.
It's quick, it's brutal, and it basically tells you everything about the chances of escaping that environment. Freedom's an illusion, just like the saying.
Okay, lastly, let's touch on sound. Rocket's first-person narration is obviously central. It immediately puts you, the viewer, in the position of hearing his story, his version of the truth.
But what's really fascinating, according to the sources, is how the other elements, the visuals, the editing, sometimes push back against that narration. They complicate it or subtly contradict what Rocket's telling you.
Makes you question him a bit, or at least realize his view isn't the whole story.
Exactly. It adds layers. And the diegetic music, the music within the world of the film, it's used so deliberately. Like Benet dancing to James Brown's Sex Machine.
Yeah, that's not just background noise. It totally captures his vibe, his cool guy persona as a dealer.
Right. And then later, at his farewell party, you get kung fu fighting. Talk about irony.
Oh yeah, this upbeat, almost cartoony song about fighting, playing while this incredibly messy, real ugly violence breaks out.
It's a stark counterpoint. It highlights the massive gap between some romantic idea of combat and the actual brutality. The sources noted how often the music acts as a seductive counterpoint, to the violence. Not necessarily tense music, but something catchy, maybe even upbeat, that feels almost jarring against the visuals.
Which leads to the music over the end credits, that saudade music, that whole Brazilian idea of like happy, sad nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
The music definitely nails that feeling, but the sources raise a really critical point about it. Does that nostalgic feeling maybe work against the impact of the horror, the deprivation you've just spent 2 hours watching?
It's a really good question for analysis, isn't it? Does
Yeah.
it kind of soften the blow,
Yeah.
let the audience off the hook, maybe feel a bit wistful instead of angry or horrified about the systemic problems? It definitely complicates how you interpret the film's final message.
So, okay, pulling those formal elements together, the dynamic camera, the deliberate mise-en-scène, that energetic editing, the strategic sound. The big takeaway here is that City of God uses every cinematic tool it has to create this visceral, subjective experience. It's designed to make you feel the chaos and intensity of that world.
Exactly. And understanding how it's built technically flows right into what it all means and how it affects you.
Yeah.
So let's shift focus now to representation, how the film portrays its characters, its groups. The character structure itself is pretty sprawling, isn't it?
Yeah, 13 major characters, 11 secondary, plus those nameless runts. And a striking point from the sources was how few traditional families you see. Just glimpses of Rockets and
Right,
Neds.
many characters, especially the younger gang members, they don't seem to have much backstory, do they? Or deep motivations beyond just power and survival, which the sources suggest can make them feel a bit two-dimensional sometimes.
You really see that when you compare Ned and Zay. Ned looks different, assured, handsome, taller. We get his background in the army, working outside the favela. And crucially, his reason for turning to violence is clear. Revenge for what happened to his family.
Whereas Zay, his motivation feels different, doesn't it? The sources talk about him having this almost inherent evilness coming out of that childhood brutality, seemingly just driven by a lust for power. There's less explanation.
Yeah, Ned starts off almost like a tragic hero figure. The community welcomes him back initially to fight Zay, but then he gets consumed by the violence too.
The film absolutely centers on a very aggressive form of masculinity. And, well, unfortunately, the sources were pretty clear about the depiction of female characters, overwhelmingly passive, peripheral.
Mostly there to be victims of male violence, sadly.
Yeah. Shorty's wife attacked, Dawn Azealia, Blackie's girlfriend, Ned's girlfriend. Attacked, murdered, raped. Even characters like Berenice and Angelica, who seem more observant at first, they just kind of disappear from the story. We don't know what happens to them.
In Marina, her main role seems to be helping Rocket transition into adulthood and the outside world of journalism. Their roles are pretty much defined by the men around them and the violence.
So in terms of representation, what we're seeing is a film focused squarely on this brutal, hyper-masculine world of violence and power struggles, with women playing largely reactive or symbolic roles.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit to aesthetics generally. The film's overall style, its influences, the director's voices, the sources gave some insight into how Morels and Lund work together.
Yeah, Morels was more focused on the visuals, the images, but Katia Lund's role was absolutely critical. She brought the deep knowledge of the favelas, managed the crew, worked heavily on character development.
Morels didn't have that firsthand knowledge, right? So Lund's connections, her understanding, were vital for getting that authenticity, for actually filming in those locations.
And importantly, they set up that Nosto Cinema workshop, trained young people from the favelas, some of whom ended up being cast. That direct community connection was significant.
We should also probably link City of God back to earlier Brazilian cinema, specifically Cinema Novo from the 60s. What was their whole thing?
An idea in your head and a camera in your hand. That was the mantra. It was about showing Brazilian reality, the exploitation, the violence, the poverty, with this raw, direct honesty.
City of God definitely feels like it's carrying that spirit forward, doesn't it? But updating it for a different time, different technology.
For sure. And Rocket, our narrator, he's based on a real person, right?
Yeah.
Wilson Rodriguez, photographer.
Yeah, and his job as a photographer isn't just incidental. It lends his perspective this air of objectivity, even when the film itself is super stylized. He's there, camera ready, documenting that final shootout.
His character acts as that vital link, connecting the very local, specific reality of the City of God favela to this broader national and then international view of Brazilian slums.
What I found really interesting was how the sources pointed out this mix. The film uses the idea of the objective reporter revealing truth, but at the same time, its own style is highly manipulated, highly constructed. It's definitely not a documentary, even if it borrows some documentary techniques.
Right, so the key takeaway on aesthetics. Morels and Lund blend that raw political energy of Cinema Novo with a very modern, kinetic, constructed style. And they cleverly use Rocket's objective camera eye as a sort of narrative frame within that constructed reality.
Okay, so with the form and meaning covered, let's take that step back now and look at the contexts, the things that shaped this film. First up, the social context of Brazil at the time.
Yeah, 2002. Brazil was, a developing nation, huge country, largest in Latin America, fifth largest in the world by area and population, about 164 million people back then.
And the poverty stats the sources gave, they were pretty stark. Around 20% of the population, something like 32 million people, living in absolute poverty.
That level of poverty is hard to grasp. And the wealth gap, just massive, greater than most countries. The poorest got something like 2% of the national income, while the richest 10% got over half.
That huge inequality, it's not just background noise in the film, is it? It feels like a driving force behind the environment, the desperation, the motivations.
Absolutely fundamental. Then, historically, you've got the deep roots of Portuguese colonization back in the 16th century, the oppression of indigenous people,
Independence in the 19th century.
and the massive, brutal legacy of the slave trade from West Africa, only abolished late in the 19th century. The multi-ethnic communities we see are shaped by that history, descendants of enslaved people, immigrants, all navigating this complex past.
Politically, the 20th century saw a lot of U.S. economic influence. But 2002, the year the film came out, was significant politically, wasn't it?
Very. That was the year Lula da Silva was elected
Yeah.
from the Workers' Party, the first left-wing government Brazil had seen in over 40 years.
And his whole platform was about fairer economic prosperity, right? A direct response to the kind of inequality the film depicts.
Exactly. So releasing City of God right into that moment with this new government promising change, it adds another layer to how it was received, its relevance at the time.
Technologically, the sources stressed how important digital editing was. Editor Daniel Rezende could just experiment endlessly, couldn't he? Not constrained by cutting physical film.
Yeah, try out different rhythms, different cuts. He apparently claimed that a lot of the character interpretations were actually kind of found or shaped in the editing room, playing with the actors' improvisations. The tech really enabled that distinctive, flexible style.
And finally, institutionally, who paid for it? Who got it out there? Big players in Brazil, TV Globo, the biggest TV network, and O2 Films, a major commercial company.
And then internationally, the distributor was Miramax, headed up by the Weinsteins back then. Miramax had this reputation for taking international films, independent films, and giving them a huge global platform.
Right. Getting picked up by Miramax really cemented City of God's status as this major international art house hit. It fit their image of dealing with edgy, challenging films.
Definitely.
Okay, so putting all those contexts together, what's the main point? It seems like City of God came out of this very specific Brazilian moment, extreme inequality, a heavy historical legacy, a hopeful political shift, new digital tools, and all of that shaped how it was made and how it landed globally.
Absolutely. And looking back over everything, the complex form, the powerful representations, the aesthetics echoing Cinema Novo, those crucial contexts, the film really is a masterclass, isn't it? It blends this feeling of almost objective documentation, especially through Rocket's camera, with a super stylized, constructed, and very subjective cinematic vision of that reality.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to chew on. Thinking about Rocket, the photographer, trying to capture truth from inside the chaos. And thinking about the film's own intense techniques, speeding up violence, that seductive music showing that stark inequality. How does the actual act of documenting extreme violence and poverty, whether with a still camera like Rocket's or through cinema itself, how does that act shape our understanding of it? And maybe even shape the reality being shown?
Yeah, that's a great question. Does the film ultimately just ask you to observe, like Rocket often tries to? Or does its intense, sometimes uncomfortable style push you towards something else, a more critical kind of engagement, perhaps?
Yeah.
Definitely something to think about as you continue to unpack this incredible film.